Alright, grab your Doritos and your Mountain Dew and get ready to nerd out. Today's topic, weapon proficiencies in role-playing games. You're probably familiar with the concept that in many systems you were able to apply your weapon skill or proficiency to a different type of weapon at a penalty. So is that realistic? Kind of a fun thing to talk about. So since it's been a long time, I'm just gonna look into the GURPS rulebook as an example to refresh my memory of how it's done. So there are different categories here. There's fencing weapons, flails, impact weapons, pole weapons, swords, whips, and other weapons. And then within these broad groups, you have subcategories. For example, under swords, you have broadswords, force swords, knives, which are not technically swords, but for classification, to make it simpler, it makes sense. Short swords, two-handed swords. And then the skills in each of these categories can be applied to another category at -3. So for example, if you're proficient at two-handed swords, you can use a broadsword at -3. And there are also crossovers between the groups. For example, a mangoj or parrying dagger like this, which normally falls under the fencing weapons group, can be used with the knife or jite/sai skill at -4. And then there's also the related concept that allows a character to use a weapon for which they don't have proficiency just based on physical attributes. So using a weapon with, say, dexterity, dex -5 or what have you. And so that would represent an intuitive use of the weapon, which wouldn't be anywhere near as effective as a trained use, but at the same time, it wouldn't make sense for a character to pick up, say, a sword and they have never been trained in the use of a sword, and they would just be like, incompatible, does not compute, I cannot use this. They would still try to use it, of course, and if they are vaster, stronger, etc., smarter than the opponent, they may still be able to do fairly well. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, how much sense does it make to translate one to the other? If you've been watching my videos for a while, you already know the answer. It depends. It really does. I mean, if you take, for example, a parrying dagger, European parrying dagger, you're trained with this, but then you're forced to use a sai. You could probably do that relatively well. Certain penalty makes sense because it's not specialized for that particular fighting style. But I mean, you still have a pronounced guard that you can catch an opponent's sword with, and it still applies to a large extent. Vice versa, I can't say as much because I'm not trained in the use of a sai. I'm not familiar with the fighting style in particular. The extra guard on a lot of European parrying daggers might get in the way. However, if you've got a knife and try to use your parrying dagger skill with it, that's not going to work. You just don't have enough to work with. For one, parrying daggers generally have a symmetrical handle because you actually don't hold it like this, with the knuckles aligning with the edge the way you normally would, but you have it the other way around and you put your thumb on the flat of the blade. So for this, the handle needs to be symmetrical so you can hold it well. And that's also why the additional ring or guard is where it is. So if you engage with an opponent's blade and you bind and displace it, this is there to protect you. Of course, you don't have that kind of protection with a knife like this. You also have an asymmetrical handle. You could try to use this, but you have so much less blade to actually parry with and bind with that you might as well just use your bare hand almost. So this wouldn't work terribly well. Just like if you're trained in the use of a parrying dagger and you've never done knife fighting and now you end up in a knife fight where both you and your opponent have one, then you have to improvise, so you can't really use your skill in that. Now, you can always use it to an extent, because footwork in general is quite often similar. Not always, but the basics, there are certain fundamental basics that are often the same, because the human body moves in certain ways. You know, there are biomechanics that, you know, only allow so many variations in how you can move in a fight. For example, unarmed combat, unarmed martial arts, a lot of them, say MMA, boxing, have some similarities in the footwork to historical swordsmanship. And if you know the basic footwork with one weapon, it probably carries over to another. Kenjutsu and European longsword fighting are different, of course, in a lot of ways, but the basic footwork and movements also look pretty recognizable. So you could absolutely, if you're proficient with a katana, you could absolutely pick up a longsword and use it that way. If you're proficient with a longsword, you could pick up a katana. I think in this case, you would be more limited as a longsword user with a katana, because a lot of longsword techniques require a straight double-edged blade to work, which you don't have with a katana. With a katana, you know, some of the more slicing cuts, of course, also wouldn't work as well with a longsword, because the longsword does more of a hewing action. So it would be suboptimal, but you wouldn't die necessarily. So you would still be able to defend yourself, you would still be able to fight. But there are also false friends. The habits that you have could actually interfere and sabotage you. For example, here is a falchion, which I can cut with reasonably well. I'm pretty familiar with straight swords, be it double-edged or single-edged, and some moderately curved blades as well, I'm okay with. But if I had to use this Indian tulwar here, I'd be kind of screwed. Now, for one, the handle is too short for me. I can only barely squeeze my hand in there, kind of uncomfortable and not very efficient. The other problem is the grip is very different. You've got a disc pommel here that locks the hand in a certain position and prevents me from flexing my wrist and tilting my hand forward very much, because as soon as I do that, that disc digs into the wrist, which also shows you that this sword is not designed for that kind of grip. A falchion is very much designed for a handshake grip. So this is good for a hewing cut, it gives you more reach, whereas this is, you can't do that. So this would be more of a slicing, drawing cut, and this is not something that I have practiced personally. So I wouldn't be very good cutting with this. With a shamshir like this, arguably this is also more that kind of cut, more of a slicing cut here as well, because you also see a strongly curved blade and a very pronounced pommel here. But I can kind of sneak my way around this if I want to. If I really want to use this sword the way I've learned, then I can make it work. I can kind of sneak in a handshake grip, and I can kind of use this in the ways that I'm familiar with. Suboptimal, but it still works. In general, it's definitely realistic to apply any kind of armed martial art with a single-handed weapon to have a wide variety of other single-handed weapons. So if you've learned to fight with a broadsword, saber, even a short sword, dusak, any kind of thing like that, you could apply that to long knives, machetes, absolutely. Even axes, you know, even though an axe handles substantially differently, it's essentially like an upside down sword, the basic mechanics can still be applied. I mean, you would do things somewhat differently. For instance, while with a fairly light balanced sword, you might stop the cut in the low guard position. With a more top heavy blade or an axe, that wouldn't be as feasible because of the extra momentum. But it's easy to modify that. So instead of stopping it here, you would just follow through and, you know, let the momentum do its thing, essentially. So there would be ways to work around that, and yeah, absolutely, the penalty would apply. There are exceptions like rapiers, for example. If you have learn to fight with any other sword or most other swords, you know, be it an arming sword or a long sword or a saber, katana, etc., it doesn't really apply or translate to the rapier. The rapier is highly specialized and it's very complex and technical. A lot of other weapons are too, of course. Many martial arts are very technical. But this you can't really figure out on your own. Like, I can definitely say in my case, I've practiced both. Rapier nowhere near as much as longsword, but I can definitely tell either way that they are very separate skills. My experience with a longsword helps me very, very little with a rapier. Really nothing aside from the basics of footwork. A lunge with a rapier is done very differently than a thrust with a lot of other swords. So this is quite different. There's much more focus on binds, on constraining the opponent's blade, and then moving in with a thrust while you control their blade. That happens with other swords too, but that's really the main name of the game here. So rapier wouldn't translate as well. Also, if you are proficient in the rapier and then you pick up a falchion, you're just as screwed, because there are cuts in rapier fencing, but they aren't as prominent and they are not done quite the same way as with something like this. So it would be very difficult to adjust to that. So in my opinion, that would be as close as it gets to you can't. And you could still argue that, yeah, with a penalty, a massive penalty, you could use it still. So the logic is still sound. Now, staves, pole arms, and spears are so interchangeable that I'd even argue you wouldn't even need a penalty necessarily, because it's all a long pole. Whether or not you have something at the end, it changes the balance, absolutely. But the basic techniques and body mechanics are very much interchangeable. The way you strike with a quarterstaff, and I'm saying quarterstaff here deliberately, you hold a bow staff a lot differently than a quarterstaff or a polearm. Quarterstaff is held like this, so if you have something at the end to strike with, it doesn't make that much of a difference. It's going to be heavier, it's going to hit harder, of course, but it doesn't make that much of a difference. Also with a spear, I mean, in the historical manuals with the quarterstaff, there are plenty of thrusts in there already. So you have a point on it, good, even better. Anyway, so stuff like this can be used really well in storytelling. Say, for example, you have a character that is a cocky master saber fencer and is forced in a fight to pick up a different type of sword. Or just goes, yeah, I'm awesome. I'm the master with a blade and I will own you. And then he picks it up and just goes like, wait, what? Huh? This is so different. This feels very different. How do I do this? Like the example I mentioned where suddenly your wrist is locked in and you cannot use the techniques that you normally use. And that could very much throw this character off. Enough to completely fail at it? Probably not, but enough to introduce some tension, I suppose. Anyway, hope you found this entertaining. If you liked the video, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Or maybe you want to buy some razor blades. This also helps out the channel. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good one, folks.